The natural ebb and flow of game genres often means that some naturally pull ahead of the pack, leaving others behind at the wayside as the public tries something new. It's happened many times before, is happening now, and will inevitably happen again. In recent years, independent horror games began to fall into a rhythm, with similar games hitting digital store shelves so often that many began to run together. But then, one game came out, Five Nights at Freddy's, and scared the living daylights out of a genre with a fresh take on a simple idea. Starting in the 1990s and early 2000s, a man named Scott Cawthon began working in 3D animation and video game development. Cawthon, a religious man, began creating animations and games based on his Christian values, including a few titles he independently released in the latter half of the aughts. These included games like Sit and Survive, Chipper & Sons Lumber Company, and The Desolate Hope. However, reception for these games was not as friendly as their message. Criticism leaned heavily on Cawthon's art direction for these titles. Many players and several prominent reviewers felt that the characters in his games, specifically in Chipper & Sons Lumber Company, moved and interacted with one another in unnatural ways, lost disturbingly deep in the uncanny valley. They were likened to the horrifying animatronics often seen at cheap restaurants or theme parks, enough so that many called the resemblance creepy or unintentionally terrifying. Initially, this feedback discouraged Cawthon, who almost decided to stop developing games entirely. However, Cawthon eventually took the criticism to heart and decided to use his animatronic-like character designs and animations to his advantage, crafting a world and a horror narrative based around that concept. If people believed his lighthearted games were scary, he'd give them something to really scream about. The new direction, which would feature an animatronic-themed chain of restaurants, was not unlike the real-world Chuck E. Cheese chain of pizzerias, which had already inspired many nightmares in the youth of America. The world Cawthon created was that of Five Nights at Freddy's, which takes place in a chain of themed restaurants known as Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria. The franchise, both the restaurants and the games, is built around the iconography of its star, an animatronic bear named Freddy Fazbear, and his compatriots, Bonnie the Bunny, Chica the Chicken, and Foxy the Pirate Fox. These characters were Cawthon's attempt at creating something deliberately disturbing, and in doing so, he decided to have them rarely move. This was intentional, as Cawthon believes such still animatronics, both in the real world and in his series of games, are creepier when they are unmoving. He explained, it's when they are turned off that the veil is lifted, and you realize that they were never alive. They are, and always have been, dead. Five Nights at Freddy's puts the player in the shoes of a newly hired night watch security guard at Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria. But something is off about this location. Something is wrong. Every night, the player appears to be alone, accompanied only by a series of voicemails left by their predecessor at the pizzeria. However, occasionally, the animatronic animals slowly come to life and wander about the restaurant, something allowed by management seemingly to avoid mechanical malfunctions. Supposedly, if the machines are left off and unmoving for too long, their components will lock up and need repair. The animatronics begin moving about the restaurant, seemingly with no rhyme or reason. However, if the animatronics come across a human during this period, their programming assumes that they are a fellow animatronic endoskeleton that isn't wearing its suit. The machines will then forcibly stuff them into one of their mechanized suits, a fate that will kill whomever falls victim to it. Five Nights at Freddy's is, at its root, a survival horror experience that acts similarly to point-and-click games. At least in the first title, the player does not move from their office and simply interacts with buttons and objects in the room. Players must survive their night shift, which lasts approximately 8.5 minutes of real time, blocking off the animatronics that get too close to the office. They are given access to the restaurant's network of security cameras, with which they can track the movements of the animatronic animals. They're also able to briefly close the doors to their office and illuminate the hallways on either side of the room to check if any of the animals are lurking outside of the door. However, all of these actions consume power from a limited pool, And if the player exhausts their electrical reserves, the power will run out, the cameras will stop working, the lights will turn off, and the doors will remain open, leaving the player completely defenseless. As per Cawthon's design philosophy, the player rarely ever sees the animatronics actually physically move. Instead, they are mostly seen standing still, yet somehow moving through the pizzeria when the player looks away. This, alongside the curation of the player's limited pool of power, is the core of what makes the gameplay of Five Nights at Freddy's really work. Behind everything else, Five Nights at Freddy's is a resource management experience, with a harsh punishment for failure. In universe, the character dies. In-game, the player is given a startling jump scare. In earlier levels, it's not really a problem. The player can be quite liberal with their usage of power. But on higher difficulties, one misclick, one mistake, one small timing error can lead the player to their untimely demise. Though many have assumed that the jump scares are the backbone of the horror in Five Nights at Freddy's, they are slightly off mark. Those jump scares are simply a failure state. The horror in the game comes from the anticipation of the scares, and doing everything you can to stop them. In a genre oftentimes filled with games that leave players defenseless, their only options being to run, hide, and cower from the threats the world puts before them, Five Nights at Freddy's was mechanically a breath of fresh air. It let players survive as long as they were smart with their abilities, as long as they conserved them when necessary, and as long as they used them strategically. Though they didn't use a gun or a crowbar, for all intents and purposes, players could fight back against the death lurking through the restaurant. And much of the horror of the game comes from the stress of coordinating all of their available resources. In many ways, this reflects multiple aspects of the real world. Keeping track of the animatronics while simultaneously conserving power and closing doors when needed isn't too dissimilar from the stresses of juggling professional and personal tasks and responsibilities. One could say that surviving a night with Freddy is nothing but a fantasized version of paying your taxes, or trying to get a big project done on time, or coordinating a group of friends with different schedules, or doing all of that at the same time. Of course, that wasn't the only piece of the puzzle. Much of what made Five Nights at Freddy's work as a horror experience can be attributed to its world and backstory. As the player continues through the Five Nights at Freddy's campaign, or takes the time to look into the franchise's lore, they may come to realize that something else is happening with these mechanical monsters. Something otherworldly. Newspaper clippings in one of the pizzeria's hallways reveals that a mass murder happened on site, in which 5 children were lured into a back room and disappeared. Later, complaints were filed against the restaurant, claiming that the animatronics began to smell foul, that their eyes and mouths were stained with mucus and blood. Putting 2 and 2 together, it seems more than likely that those kids never disappeared, that they were instead forced into these machines. Perhaps that is what killed them. We know that that is the fate that befalls one forced into a functional animatronic. Or perhaps their corpses were simply hidden there. Perhaps the reason Freddy and his friends wander the restaurant at night isn't because of any mechanical hardware malfunctions. Maybe, just maybe, the spirits of the children are trapped and searching for vengeance. But that's silly. Ghosts aren't real. Are they? Perhaps what made Five Nights at Freddy's successful more than anything else was its vibrant fan community and Cawthon's interaction with it. There was a real mystery in the world of Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria, whether intentional or not. An unsolved series of murders which only grew more interesting and complex as the series continued. A strange connection to the occult and the otherworldly, something that was never stated explicitly but was obviously there. Strange, Atari-inspired minigames seemingly disconnected from the rest of the story, but that ended up having connections that ran deep. There was a lot left unspoken in the base game of Five Nights at Freddy's, and many fans were desperate to decode what hidden meaning laid underneath that surface. A community grew around this mystery, and many worked into the late hours of the evening and the wee hours of the morning, deciphering little hints and clues dropped by Cawthon on his websites and in his games. It was a vibrant and unique time for a group of fans that largely could be defined and connected because of their passion for this small, independent horror game made by just one man. Five Nights at Freddy's was released on Desura on August 8th, 2014, and then approved for Steam Greenlight on August 20th, 2014. It was later also released on Android and iOS. The game was a massive step away from Cawthon's previous work, not only in terms of its tone, but also in its critical and commercial reception. Critics felt that generally, though Five Nights at Freddy's mechanics were slightly bare bones, what was there was interesting and worth playing. Commercially, the game was a surprise hit, and though no official numbers have been released, it's more than likely that hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of copies have been sold across all of its release platforms. Five Nights at Freddy's is an anomaly, a horror game made by a religious man with a background in wholesome entertainment. A thrilling horror game built on resource management, closing doors and turning on lights at the right time with a layer of the supernatural hidden barely beneath. An independent game made by one man which has exploded into an industry phenomenon, with multiple sequels, spin-offs, and books released as part of its canon and a big-budget film adaptation on the way. It proves that you don't have to tread familiar ground to find success. Sometimes, all you need is to find a new way to thrill your players. Hey there, if you don't know me, my name's Lee, and alongside editing some episodes of game theory and film theory here and there, I run the Breakdown show here on the Theorists. If you like Breakdown and want to see more content like it from me and a couple other YouTubers you might be unfamiliar with, mosey on over to Arcadia and check out what we do. We'll link a playlist of my videos here on screen. I particularly am really proud of my Star Trek one. It's about the best episode of Star Trek in which nothing actually happens, but man, that show's good. Anyway, thanks a million, guys, and I'll see you next time. Man, that show's good.